Thank you all for joining us. I'm one of the co-founders of the Lower Manhattan Historical Society, Arthur Piccolo. I have a few remarks here. I will leave it to Lower Manhattan Historical Society co-founder and president, Jim Kaplan, to briefly speak to Albert Gallatin's many achievements that has us gathering here today in Trinity Churchyard at his grave on the anniversary of his birth on January 29th, 1761, in Geneva, Switzerland. Let me say a few words about the even wider purpose of our efforts at the Society, formed just last year, and that Albert Gallatin represents so nobly. We believe there are a range of significant historical events and important individuals from history with intimate relationships to Lower Manhattan, events and individuals worth remembering that do not receive the attention or appreciation they deserve today in our time. Or put another way, history is where the present was forged and our future begins. In terms of Albert Gallatin, this is further heightened in that the very first event organized by the Society was to gather right here last August 12th for a similar wreath ceremony to remember the anniversary of Gallatin's death. So there is no doubt Gallatin, who indeed played an important role in the very early development of the well-respected New York Historical Society and was president of that group at the time of his death. There is no doubt were Gallatin alive today, he would eagerly join us at events like this. Now I am proud to introduce someone who represents another of Gallatin's greatest achievements, his founding of New York University. Whitty, Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs, New York's Gallatin School.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. My name is Michael Dinwiddie. I'm the Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs at the Gallatin School, and I bring you greetings from our school. And I want to tell you that I'm a graduate of the Gallatin School. I graduated in 1980 from the Gallatin School. And Gallatin is an interdisciplinary school. It's a school that really helps people learn how to negotiate and think about modern life, and that's what Albert Gallatin was about and what he was interested in. We know his history, we love the stories of Gallatin. I have lots of things to say, but we're out in the cold, so I'll keep my remarks very brief. When we go inside, I'll talk a little bit more about him. But the one thing I want to say is a few nights ago I went to the New York Shakespeare Festival to see a fantastic play called Alexander Hamilton by Lin Miranda. It was quite wonderful and quite amazing. And I thought to myself, it's time for Albert Gallatin to be represented in the same way, to be on the stage and to be understood for the contributions he made to America as a Treasury Secretary, as an entrepreneur, as an immigrant who really had to make his way in this country in a time when it was a really new country, and a man who really was progressive in his thinking. So I want to thank you for inviting me as a member of the Gallatin School and Gallatin faculty. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm thankful that you're honoring Albert Gallatin.
Thank you, sir. Now a few words from a proud NYU graduate, a long-standing Gallatin advocate, and the founder of the Museum of American Finance, John Herzog.
It's wonderful to be here and to see all your smiling faces, and to think that we will assemble here again each year from now on.
Thank you, John. We also have a distinguished guest with us today, Mr. Gallatin himself, by way of Gallatin interpreter, Mr. Duquette. And Mr. Gallatin has a few words for us, I'm sure.
It is particularly significant that as time goes on, more and more people should begin to recognize the contributions that Albert Gallatin gave to this country, especially given that he came as a young immigrant with nothing except a few dollars and some tea to trade on, and yet the opportunities that were provided by this country were such that he was able to return those favors by a distinguished life of public service.
Thank you, sir. I would also like to thank the fact that Mr. David Cowan, president of the Museum of American Finance, has also joined us. Thank you, David. And now some words from co-founder and president of the Lower Manhattan Historical Society, the essence of Gallatin's life, from James Kaplan.
Okay, well, thank you. I also want to point out that there are two NYU students here who will be laying the wreath, and that really shows Gallatin's impact continues on and on through students and others. The fascinating thing about Gallatin was he was born a Swiss aristocrat, but he really was a Democrat. He was a Democrat in the Western Pennsylvania. He was a Democrat in the Senate, and in the elections of 1800. He was instrumental in the election of Thomas Jefferson. And then as Secretary of Treasury, he interpreted Hamilton's program in a way that helped the Democrats. He was for 14 years the Secretary of the Treasury, the longest serving secretary ever. He was instrumental in settling the War of 1812, and then was the ambassador to France, and then came back to the United States, and in 1831 founded New York University, really as a university for the people. Unlike Columbia and the other more aristocratic universities which were associated with the religious institutions, the idea of NYU was that working people would be educated in this city, and he does that, and it does that to this day. And I want to welcome the students who represent, in a way, the future of the city, who we're going to ask to lay the wreath on his grave. Why don't you introduce yourself? Caroline Kaplan and
Helen O'Lavin.
And Helen O'Lavin. Okay.
All right, and before we lay the wreath, I would like to offer special thanks to the parish of Trinity Church, the new rector, Reverend Dr. William Lupfer, and likewise Chief Verger David Jetty, and most of all to thank everyone who came out today on a winter's day to honor the memory of Albert Gallatin. And now we'll place the wreath at his grave.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a very special evening. I'm David Cowan, President of the Museum of American Finance. I'd like just to point out in attendance tonight we have our Chairman of the Board, Professor Richard Silla. We have our Founder and Chairman of the Board Emeritus, John Herzog. And we also want to point out that the members of the Lower Manhattan Historical Society are here. They just laid a wreath at the Gallatin grave up at Trinity Church, represented by Arthur Piccolo and James Kaplan. There's one other person I'm going to call up now for just a few words, and that is Michael Dinwiddie of NYU's Gallatin School. He's the Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs, and he wants to say a few words, so please, Professor.
Okay, Albert Gallatin was the Albert Gallatin School of Individualized Study at NYU. It's named after a man who really fits our model of what a student should be. A self-starter, someone interested in many different areas, someone who takes his education very seriously. Albert Gallatin was someone who really thought that it was important for our democracy to have people who were educated in order to be able to participate. So the Gallatin School is about citizenship, democracy, but also individualized study. Here's the story I found about Albert Gallatin in a children's book. It's a book called Fortune the Sailmaker. It was about a sailmaker in Philadelphia in the 1800s. In 1790, Albert Gallatin was a member of the Pennsylvania legislature. And he stood up as they were putting together the state constitution and argued that one word should be taken out of the Constitution. I always ask my students, what word do you think that was? So let's pretend we're a class for a moment. What word in 1790 would we be thinking about taking out of a state's constitution? God, yeah, that's a great guess. That's a great guess, it really is. The word was actually white. He was successful in his argument, and from 1790 to 1837, African American men could vote in the state of Pennsylvania. Many years later, when Mr. Gallatin was elderly, he was asked about this, and he said, I don't really recall whether or not I did that, but if I did, it was because I was swarthy, and I wanted to make sure I was never turned away from the polls. Now, for years and years, I told that story as an example of Albert Gallatin's progressive egalitarianism. Either way, it's an incredible and amazing story, which Julie...
Now we're going to get to hear from the fourth Secretary of the Treasury, and the longest serving one at that. And the foreman knows you, but let's find out a little bit about more. It's my pleasure to welcome the fourth Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin.
Which I would like to make of the story that Mr. Cohen said about the three headwaters of the Missouri River, the Jefferson, the Madison, and the Gallatin River. It is also to be noted that the Gallatin River is the shortest of the three. To give you some idea of my life up to this point, I was born on the 29th of January, which is of course today, in 1761 in Geneva, which was an independent city-state. It was not part of Switzerland at the time, and in fact had been an independent city-state since early in the 16th century. My ancestors had come from Italy. The family name was originally Gallatini. My father's name was also Jean Gallatin. He was a successful clockmaker. My mother's name was Sophie Albertine Rolaz. She was also descended from a prominent family in Geneva. My father, unfortunately, died when I was 4 years old. My mother, who attempted to run the clockmaking business, soon found herself overwhelmed not simply by and gave me over to the care of a distant relative of my father, Mademoiselle Catherine Pictet. It is a truth that though I was not of her flesh and blood, she raised me as though I were her son. And I am grateful to this day for her care. She educated me at home. I was sent eventually at the age of 13 to l'Académie de Genève, which is equivalent to a university education such as would be found at Cambridge or Oxford or Bologna or the Sorbonne or Heidelberg. At age 17, with a great interest in natural philosophy and in Latin and in numbers, I graduated from the l'Académie, and because of this, I had no interest in becoming a member of the judiciary. I had no interest in becoming a soldier, and so I began to look for a place to go and to make my own way. And of course, by this point, in 1779 and 1780, the United States had begun and had been fighting, prosecuting its revolution for a number of years. And it seemed to me that I should wish to go to the freest country in the universe. And so with a friend of mine, Henri Serre, we were to be joined later by Jean Badelet, who was another schoolmate. We left in 1780 and went west to France and boarded ship and eventually landed in Cape Anna, just north of Boston. Eventually went to Boston and proceeded to find that Boston was very reminiscent, in fact, of Geneva. Everybody was terribly interested in making money, and everybody was terribly interested in religion. And so I decided that this was not a place that I particularly enjoyed being at. And so with Henri, we decided, with our consignment of all things, tea, we would go to Fort Machias in the county of Maine. And we spent the winter there. I purchased land in the west of Pennsylvania, at which time I also took the oath of allegiance to the Commonwealth of Virginia, because at that time, that part of Pennsylvania was still a disputed part between Pennsylvania and Virginia. And I took this oath at Monongalia Courthouse in 1785. That date is important, believe me. Also, I met in Richmond at the time, because we also went to Richmond to register the land grants and the applications and the lands that we were purchasing. I met Mr. Marshall, who is now our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Mr. Marshall had just begun his career as a lawyer, had just established himself in Richmond, and when he met me, for whatever reason, I impressed him, and he offered me the opportunity to read law with him, and eventually, once I passed the bar, to join him in his law firm. I also, in terms of the politics. In 1788, I was in Harrisburg, where the discussion came up about the Constitution, which had been ratified by Pennsylvania as the second state. And there were a number of us who felt very strongly that the Constitution lacked certain essentials, not the least of which was an enumerated Bill of Rights. However, most of my fellow delegates felt very strongly that we should have a continuing series of constitutional conventions. I disagreed with them because it would be difficult for any government to establish itself properly if it was constantly under essential review. And so what I proposed, and what eventually was accepted by the Federal Congress, the first Federal Congress, was the need for an enumerated bill of individual rights. I was elected to the Pennsylvania State Legislature for 3 successive terms in 1790, 91, and 92. But in 1791 began perhaps the most, well, at least I assume that there are some Hamiltonians in the room, the most infamous period of my young life, which was my involvement with the Whiskey Rebellion. One of the things which is not well known about the Whiskey Rebellion is why should it have occurred in Pennsylvania, of all places? It was not the only place which protested the imposition of the excise tax that Colonel Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, had proposed, and which had in fact had passed Congress. In western New York, in the Kentucky country, in Tennessee, in western North Carolina, in the 3 westernmost counties of South Carolina, there were also protests against this excise tax. But why was Pennsylvania the one place which seemed to be most rebellious? Because there were people who were willing to play the role of the taxman. In all the other places, no one wished to put themselves in a position to collect the taxes. This is why the rebellion is centered on Pennsylvania, on western Pennsylvania. And of course the fundamental issue was the excise tax was supposed to be a tax on consumption. It was supposed to be everyone drank whiskey, therefore everyone should be willing to pay for it. It was in fact a tax on production. It favored those manufacturers, those distillers of whiskey in the East, because they could run their stills 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So even though they might have paid gross sum more than those in the West, in terms of a percentage of their total production in the West, it was the only way to convert bulk grains such as rye and barley into a more transportable means, and which was frequently accepted as money, as a bill of exchange. And so this is why the farmers in the West protested against the excise tax. To bring it rather more rapidly to a point, in 1793, I was selected by the legislature of the state of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as one of its 2 senators. And this was something of a surprise, because I was, by this point, considered to be a Jefferson Republican. The legislature was dominated by the Federalists. I am pleased to think that the reason that they selected me was because they felt that I would do hard work in the Senate of the United States for Pennsylvania. I did point out to them, however, that having only taken the oath of allegiance in 1785, that I did not meet the constitutional requirement to be a senator of 9 years. 1785 to 1793 is only 8 years. They said it would not be a difficulty, and so they sent me to the Senate. In the meantime, I had gotten married for the 2nd time to a lady from this city, Hannah Nicholson, who was the 2nd of 4 daughters and 1 son of the Commodore James Nicholson Sr., whom I am sure that some of you may recognize the name. He was a figure that was prominent in our Navy during the late Revolution. Hannah Nicholson and I had married in November of 1793. Of course, I took the oath of office for the Senate, and the next day 19 electors from York protested my selection as a senator, and in that I did not meet the constitutional requirement for residency as a citizen. Exactly what I had said would be the difficulty. Although I was eventually removed from office in a strict party vote, 14 to 12, I was able to accomplish one thing. I submitted a bill which required the Treasury to list specifically what appropriations were being used to do. Not to ask for a general appropriation, but to say so much to go to the military, so much to go to the Navy, so much to go to the Treasury, so much to go for the State Department and its ministries abroad, and so on. This very much annoyed Colonel Hamilton. He protested that he did not have the means to be able to provide such specific information. I was removed from office, and then in 1794, which was the culmination of the Whiskey Rebellion, so-called, eventually 13,000 militia were called out to, as I like to describe it, be an elephant attempting to crush a flea of a rebellion. The militia was called out, and Mr. Hamilton and I had a very uncomfortable discussion when he arrived with the 13,000 militia. I do not think it too far to say that I believe he wished to see me hanged as a troublesome sort, but he realized and had imposed upon him the understanding that I had in fact preached moderation to all those who would otherwise have sought violence, and that if he hanged me, he would have to hang very many others. The next year, 1795, I was elected to the House of Representatives as a representative of the 12th District of Pennsylvania, and for the next 6 years I served there, the first two with Mr. Madison, and we began to raise questions of the way that the Federalists were conducting business in the nation. In 1801, there was an election which was disputed. I was at that time at least the titular head of the party in the House of Representatives, though it was dominated by the Federalists, and it was my responsibility to make sure that Mr. Jefferson should be elected, as was intended all along, the President of the United States and not Colonel Burr. And after 36 ballots, Senator Mr. Bayard, who was the representative of Delaware, withdrew, absented himself, and eventually Mr. Jefferson became president. I was named as an interim, as a recess appointment, as the Secretary of the Treasury in May of 1801, and served in that post officially until February of 1814, though effectively I left the office in May of 1813 when I was sent by Mr. Madison to begin to treat with the English through the mediation of the Russians to try to bring about an end to the War of 1812. I go over this period very quickly because I have a feeling that Mr. Cohen will be asking me some questions on this period, and so I do not wish to either steal his thunder, nor do I wish to bore you with a recitation of all these sorts of things. And so we have just successfully concluded in Ghent a negotiation with the English, directly with the English, to bring about an end to the War of 1812, or Mr. Madison's War, depending upon where you stand. And we hope that the Senate will, in fact, advise the President to accept it and will consent to its terms. And if that is so, as Mr. Quincy Adams himself has said, it is hoped, it is our pious hope that that is the last treaty of peace that we shall ever have to sign with England. And so that, in a very brief, very cursory way, is an examination of my life up to this point.
Before I ask a few questions, Ambassador Shallery has joined us from the Swiss Council General. If you could just rise so we could acknowledge you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for that introduction. The Whiskey Rebellion, when we talked about that, thank you for touching on that. How did it feel 7 years later when you're in office and you and Mr. Jefferson destroy all those excise taxes and whiskey taxes and other Federalist taxes?
Simply a great pleasure. As it was a great pleasure, I hope, for my fellow citizens, in that we had promised that we would do what we could to eliminate taxes. It was not simply a question of eliminating a tax. It was a question of re-establishing a measure of trust with our fellow citizens. We had made this promise. We would see it through if it did not, of course, damage the nation and make life more difficult for our fellow citizens. Since it did not, we could eliminate that tax.
Now you mentioned, speaking of Mr. Jefferson, what did you think of him both personally and professionally?
Mr. Jefferson is still alive, sir.
Yes. Sorry for that mistake.
The difficulty is that no matter what it is that I say, it is bound to return to Mr. Jefferson. However, he is a gentleman of the first order. There is no one in this country whose hospitality is greater or better than a gentleman of Virginia. And I say that with all due respect to all of the New Yorkers who are here. But you must admit that the city's life is different than that on the plantations in Virginia. And it is a graciousness of life which Mr. Jefferson embodies. Insofar as to work with him, there were, of course, issues which we did not agree upon. His view of finances was very condign in terms of what Mr. Hamilton had done. And I admit, very honestly, that when I was in the House, I tended to agree with Mr. Jefferson's view in the main, but not entirely. Because I began to understand, and there is a little book that I wrote in 1796 called A Sketch of the Finances of the United States of America, in which I began to, shall we say, modify my initial distaste for the Bank of the United States. And I began to understand that the Bank of the United States actually had a benefit, was beneficial to the economic life of our nation. Mr. Jefferson's brief to me when I went into the Treasury was to destroy the Hamiltonian system, to take it apart piece by piece, and to ensure that no such thing should ever occur again. I pride myself in letting the numbers speak clearly and to see things as they are, not as others would have me see them. And after 6 months of careful examination of the Treasury's accounts, of taxes, of the bank and its operations, I returned to Mr. Jefferson and said, in essence, "Sir, that is a very bad idea." So, though we did not agree initially, he did follow my lead in much of the policy involving the Treasury during the first 6 years of his administration.
Thank you. We're going to circle back to finance in a little bit and Mr. Hamilton, but let's stick on Mr. Jefferson for the moment. Can you talk a little bit about the Louisiana Purchase, and is it true that you convinced him he didn't need a constitutional amendment?
The concern that Mr. Jefferson always had was, does the Constitution permit a particular action? If it is not written, it is thus forbidden, unless you take advantage of the amendment clause within the Constitution, and in so using this, are permitted to do things. He sent 2 letters, curiously. One to Levi Lincoln, who was his Attorney General, and my understanding of Mr. Lincoln's response was perhaps a very good lawyer's response. Well, on the one hand, but on the other hand. I, on the other hand, looked at matters as clearly as I could. First of all, if a nation does not have the right to acquire territory, either by conquest or by treaty, then she has no right for any expansion of any sort. Treaties are not entered into specifically and clearly by the Constitution, by the states. They do not have the right to enter into treaties. What is not reserved to the states is either reserved to the federal authority or to the people. I cannot imagine 5 millions of peoples gathering to try to treat with France, with Monsieur de Talleyrand and Napoleon Bonaparte to obtain the Louisiana Territory. Therefore, the only authority there exists to enter into treaties is the President of the United States, the Chief Magistrate. And so, that was the burden of my argument with Mr. Jefferson as to why he had the authority to enter into this treaty without the need for a constitutional amendment. It was already implied simply because if you do not have that right as a state, you cannot operate as a state. You cannot enter into any treaty with anyone.
And he took your advice.
And he took my advice, for which I was grateful.
You were grateful. So, we know you have strong Geneva roots. That's not exactly profligate over there. And you come into office with Mr. Jefferson. How do you feel about the national debt? And what did you do about it?
The national debt. The national debt at the time that I took office was $82 million. We had given the Federalists a very difficult time in the House, in the time that Mr. Madison and I served in the House of Representatives, about the nature of the debt. Because, in part, the Treasury did not share all of its information. At the time that assumption took place, in 1790, the debt was $75 million. We feared that it was far worse than that. But when I entered into the Treasury and I began to look at the books, it was only $82 million. In fact, the debt had not expanded to the same rate as the population had increased. Nonetheless, we felt very strongly that we had to eliminate the national debt as quickly as possible, because all of the energies of the economy would not be released if we were constantly servicing this debt, if we were constantly having to tax to service this debt. And in my calculations, by 1819, we would have eliminated the debt entirely. We were not able to do so.
Because of a war. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you financed that war?
Well, because of the war. I believe, sir, that you may be able to discuss that as well, because you are, I believe, an expert in this matter. But the financing was doing something which Mr. Hamilton had in fact proposed: bonds, the sale of bonds. Because our economy had constricted to the point where we no longer could rely upon customs duties to the amounts that we had, because our ships were in the Embargo Act of 1807, in port, unable to go out, unable to come in. We had to go to bonds. And when the war began in June of 1812, we clearly did not have, but we had been in a deficit situation for at least 3 years, and we sold bonds.
Right, private investment banking pretty much came on. So, what do you think of Alexander Hamilton personally?
I believe, sir, that when Colonel Hamilton...
Gene, that's for you, right? Get it.
I believe that when Colonel Hamilton fell in the duel, there were many in both parties who wished to deify him. My view was that as a duel went, it was a fair duel. It is difficult in the case of a man who is now no longer with us and no longer able to defend himself, to say very much negative about him personally, and I shall not enter into that discussion. Insofar as his contributions as a Secretary of the Treasury, after these many years, I must say that his actions as the Secretary of the Treasury, in the main, were to the benefit of the nation. I do not agree with a constantly revolving debt. I still disagree with that particular policy. But a central bank, the Bank of the United States, certainly keeps the other banks, in some sense, in order. There is some control over the specie. There is certainly, his actions were, in the main, designed to benefit the country as much as possible. And perhaps some of you here, hearing these words from my mouth, may wonder at it, but the truth of the matter is that, again, we must let the numbers and the truth speak to us. Despite the political differences, we must also acknowledge the truth of the matter.
My last sort of question is, I have a concern that history is not going to remember you more. I'm concerned, that you will be on a postage stamp, you'll be on some currency, but the average American might lose you to history. Do you have any thoughts on that matter?
What I did, sir, what I do, is not with a view towards history. Because you see, the difficulty is if you spend all of your time looking over your shoulder at the past, you will never see where you are going. I do not act, I hope, with an excessive concern of what history will think of me. I am concerned only at is what I do worthy of examination and I would hope emulation. Please remember, who writes the histories? In the history of the Gallic War, which is written by Julius Caesar, we do not understand what it is that Vercingetorix, the head of the Celtic tribes at Alesia, thought. He did not write his history of the Gallic Wars. We do not understand his position. History tends to be written by those who conquer or who succeed. And those who do not, or are not conquerors, have a tendency to be lost. And so all we can do, any of us, whether we are called to high office or not, is to do what needs to be done, and to do it as well as we can. And let history determine what it will. And so if, as you say, and I am amused, a postage stamp, sir. A postage stamp. I thought that we simply sent a letter and franked it and sent it on its way without having to pay, whatever. Or that I am on some currency. I would imagine a very small denomination, perhaps 10 cents or something along those lines. But if we spend time, those of us in public office, with our eyes constantly turned towards history, we will slant, we will shade our responses for fear of what others will think of us. In the end, when you go to your beds at night, you are the last person that you address. And if you can address yourself honestly, if you can say that you acted with probity, ethically, you have no fear of history, whether she remembers you or not.
Well, thank you. Please take some questions now directly from the audience.
Please.
Secretary Gallatin, being kind enough to travel into the future to be with us tonight for your birthday, and especially here in New York City, and having learned about the rest of your life, now that you know you have founded NYU, do you have any thoughts on that aspect of your life?
Again, you asked me to play the prophet, sir. I am not sure. However, there is, I believe, an important matter. I believe that there is a gentleman here who represents the administration and faculty of, and the students as well, of New York University. education is the means to guarantee the future. There is no question of that. I am a product of an excellent education. My mother, Mademoiselle Pictet, saw to it that I was educated at home, then sent me briefly to the Collège de Genève, which was a preparatory course, and then to l'Académie. She understood, and we understood in Geneva, how important it was to be educated, to have as wide a grasp as possible. But this grasp tended to be limited to aristocrats, to the uppermost range of the society. It is not the average citizen who goes on the grand tour. It is the English milord who goes on the grand tour. If we are to grow as a nation, and we are not an aristocratic nation, we must have places such as, I understand New York University to be, as a place that speaks to merchants' sons, to tradesmen's sons. Because if they understand, if they obtain a worthy education, they will be worthy citizens. They will contribute all the more because they will understand all the more, or so we hope, at least. Mr. Jefferson hopes the same with his plan for the university in Charlottesville, the University of Virginia. Did I answer your question, sir?
Thank you, Secretary.
Any other questions, please, sir? Yeah. Oh, this is the dangerous question. This is the gentleman I have been told who knows so much more about me. He knows perhaps even more than I do.
Well, you were fortunate enough to live a very long time, and
well, thank you, sir. I'm glad to hear this.
Even beyond your age tonight, and you saw that. You must have felt it was somehow poetic justice when a second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816.
This is to occur, yes.
It lasted into the 1830s, but in 1832, General Jackson, one of the successors of Thomas Jefferson, decided to veto a recharter. So you must have thought at that time that history was replaying itself. 1811, 1832.
You shock me, sir. You shocked me on several levels. First of all, that the bank should be rechartered. I had given up all hope of that, but indeed, I certainly will be working upon my return permanently to establish a second Bank of the United States. And you tell me that General Jackson has become a successor in the magistracy of Mr. Jefferson. My opinion of Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Jackson is that he is perhaps an excellent soldier, but he does not know how to follow orders. I don't know how he plans to give orders that he expects to see followed.
Well, I've read some of your writings.
Please also remember, you make me think of something else. A question which you raised earlier, sir, about Mr. Jefferson and the Constitution and the need for a constitutional amendment for the purchase of Louisiana. Comes back to an idea which I had here recently in looking at the Constitution. In the first instance, anyone who wishes to read the Constitution, as did Mr. Jefferson into all too many instances, narrowly and strictly, he must answer the question, if that instrument was so perfect that it should not be changed, why is there an amendment clause? Secondly, and I think far more fundamentally, when you look at the preamble to the Constitution, what does it say? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, we did not say, having formed a perfected union. Those who sat in Philadelphia in 1787 and began to consider how a nation so conceived should be governed, understood that it was not a fixed and final process. There was not a period at the end of the sentence. of our creation. That in fact, if anything, it was commas and semicolons and dashes and ellipses, because we do not remain static as people, as nations, as economies. And we cannot conceive of ourselves as having reached a stasis. What in politics, in life, reaches stasis, dies. And nature proves this constantly. My friends, it is exactly this which we must keep in mind when we look at our processes of government.
Thank you.